Today, I'm going to talk a little bit more about method, epistemology, so to say, with quote unquote epistemology, because when we talk about Marx and epistemology, we do not talk in, in traditional sense of the term. Yet, because the readings of this week was about, the categories of dialectics, such as, particularly about contradiction, what the contradiction means in theory, what contradiction means in practice, how metaphysical thinking, or traditional thinking deals with it, and how materialist dialectics deals with it. I'm just going to give a little bit So I divide, the lecture, what I'm going to say, into two. On the first part, I would talk mostly about contradiction, and then in the second part about method, Marx's method, which would be an answer to certain things that come up both in the first part of it and also about question that we have, what is the reason for Marx's conversion or inversion of Hegelian method, of which he speaks shortly in the in this postword to the second edition of Capital. As for contradiction, okay, so, and of course, because there was this particular reading involved as well by Evel Dilyankov. He's great, on these issues. Truly, I would say, first degree philosopher, Marxist philosopher, true Marxist and revolutionary philosopher. I think it was one of the few readings that was not Marx and Engels directly. Okay, so as for contradiction, so as you perhaps saw in the reading, both materialism, the idea is that both materialism and idealism admit that science develops through contradictions while theoretically reconstructs determination of being. The dispute, however, when it comes to how, these schools of thought, materialism and idealism, deal with contradiction. Okay, the dispute is actually about that, how, if there is, as Ilyankov says, if there is contradiction in true, correct thought, okay, in thought itself. So metaphysical thought, I'm using, of course, Ilyankov's language a little bit at this point, reduces theory to a piling up and removal of empirically observed antinomies. It explains these antinomies in terms of deficiencies of cognitive apparatus and theoretical systems. Thus, it looks for empirically universal laws that dissipate such contradictions. So according to this view, contradiction is purely a cognitive anomaly, whereas dialectics aim for resolving contradictions by deducing them from the very movement of the world. So it can be formed like this, that the only way of attaining rational resolution of contradictions in theoretical definition is through tracing the mode in which they are resolved in the movement of the objective reality, the movement and development of the world of things in themselves, so-called things in themselves. Natural sciences as well as social sciences, to the extent that they're genuine theoretical conceptual systems, aim for explaining the motion in terms of such contradictions. So let me just make a, a detour. Ilyankov actually, in another article, it is an entry to Soviet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is titled Ideal, traces back the roots of what we call the metaphysical conception of contradiction to Immanuel Kant's formulation of the ideal of reason and the universal form of scientific truth that consists in absolute, not contradictoriness of knowledge. While in ethics, this ideal appears in the form of universal imperatives, in epistemology, it comes to the fore in form of prohibition of logical contradictions. This postulate, however, according to Kant, is unrealizable because absolute universal truth cannot be attained due to temporal finitude of humans' quest for knowledge, humans and their quest for knowledge. The unattainability of universal truth in reality is expressed in the concept of thing in itself. That's what it is, okay, as the ultimate unsurmountable limit of knowledge of the world. That being the case, the appearance of contradictions in science is evaluated by Kant as an indicator of the incompleteness of knowledge, demonstrating to theoretical reason that it claims to embrace the unembraceable are condemned to eternal failure. I mean, that's the idea of thinking itself, and like finitude of knowledge. I mean, not only finitude, as a matter of fact, in a sense, impossibility of knowledge, I would say. Well, one of the, of course, the first attempts in order to overcome this, perhaps one of the most important attempts is Hegel, who, pertaining to real history, rejects the idea of non-contradiction as the ideal of humanity, that's the ideal that humanity strives for. He proposes contradiction as the motive force of scientific and intellectual progress. Not the absence, but the presence of contradiction for Hegel is the form and law of intellect's developments. Contradiction for Hegel is the very form and law of grasping the thing in itself. This formulation, we can relate this formulation actually to the idea of to the idea that human existence is contradictory in the sense that, first, human is stimulated to act by non-human material nature. Second, human's emergence as the subject agent, or as consciousness or personality is conditioned and necessitated by material nature. And third, as human acts and humanizes nature and naturalizes itself, it constitutes both subject and object, for the latter to become the source, the material, and the tool of its further action and the continuous process of humanization, etc. Which, if you remember from last week, this latter is considered as alienation in the positive abstract sense of the term. Okay, I mean, it's the abstract form as the condition of realization of subjectivity. So through each cycle, the thing in itself is constituted in a historically specific form to be negated within the next cycle by another form of its constitution. So, to the extent that Marx is concerned, now let's just move a little bit from here. The paradigmatic example of dialectical or non-metaphysical conception of contradiction, according to Ilyankov, because I'm just following his reading, is actualized and depicted in Marx's method of critical political economy, particularly in his treatment of labor value of theory. So if you read this particular name, chapter 10 of dialectical logic, so there's this, I would say, summary of the problem of, the problem in classical political economy. So Ricardo's theory of value faces an irresolvable contradiction that eventually amounted to the solution of Ricardian school of political economy. And the problem is very simple, as a matter of fact. The thing is this, according to, Ricardo is aware that labor is this, or he says that labor is substance of value. Now, there's another thing. There's also profit, and profit is also value. The other thing is that, well, according to labor theory of value, only new labor produces value. And the question is this: how is it possible that the quantity of profit is not determined by the quantity of labor expended on its production? Of course, assuming that the value of labor is paid justly. So the question is very simple. What is the source of this surplus? And this is something that if you read the text, Ilyankov deals with it in some detail, saying, what Malthus tells about this, what Mill tells about this. But eventually, what happens is that the true, say, empiricism of Ricardo's school political economists amount to this rejection of theory of value, because you know, like, because it's irresolvable in the sense that, you know, like, you have an equality that, you know, like A equals B and B equals C, but A is not equal to C at the end of the day. So what happens is they overcome supposedly this contradiction in an empirical way. I would say in empirical way by what is known as the Trinity formula. The Trinity formula considers interest, rent, and wage as three forms, or three distinct forms actually, of revenue that are originated in capital, land, and labor, respectively. So, and that's how it is, and it seems, you know, like to be okay. I mean, it seems to be correct, this way of looking at it. So I'll come back to this. It's very simple actually to resolve. So Marx's methodology, to the contrary, does not aim for eliminating contradiction from theory, as metaphysicians do, but his method is based on the assumption that contradiction in the object itself cannot be and is never resolved in any other way than by development of a reality brought with this contradiction into another higher or more advanced reality, so to say. In other words, the materialist dialectical conception of contradiction depicts the transformation of mutually exclusive poles. For instance, in this case is, you know, like it's labor, so to say, and profit, okay, into one another, so that not only the earthly kernel of these phenomena is analyzed, but also the development of these phenomena from within the forms of actual relations of life in life is explained. So in this sense, we can define dialectics as the expression of contradiction in form of the unity of opposites, or the identity in differences. As the science of transformation of opposites into each other, dialectics then is the science of transformation of reality into thought and vice versa. So let's see what is, for instance, Marx's, you know, like resolution to this problem, to this contradiction. So Marx starts with simple exchange, barter, so to say. Not barter, it's actually simple exchange. So in simple commodity exchange, that's how, you know, like we begin Capital, Das Kapital. In simple commodity exchange, value is only manifested, you know, as Ilyenkov puts it, but not created. One commodity appears as relative value, the other as the equivalent. So a commodity cannot appear in both forms simultaneously. Supposedly these are polar opposites. Yes, I mean, like the thing is this: you have a coat, you have some rice, so to say. At the moment, you know, like the coat can be the relative value, and the rice is just the equivalent for it. Okay, that's so one of them is relative value, the other one is the equal, so to say. But value, the thing is that value itself, as Ilyenko puts it, value itself does not coincide with either of these forms or with their simple mechanical unity. It happens to be a third something lying deeper. Now, there is another thing, of course. In reality, when you look at the process of exchange, on the other hand, okay, you see exactly the opposite of this. That, you know, like looking at the side of the coat owner, so to say, the rice, of course, is you know, like the relative value, the coat is the equivalent. But then if you look at from the, you know, like the perspective of the rice owner, it is the contrary, as a matter of fact. So it means that, you know, the same thing, as a matter of fact, the same commodity is at the same time the relative value and the equivalent. Okay, so I mean, if it was not the case, as a matter of fact, then exchange could not happen, of course, as also Ilyenko draws attention to. So the question is this: Does this mean that Marx contradicts himself? Or shall we say that there is something, or this is a showcase of some sort of, like a contradictory reality in a sense? So is the contradictory there in reality? Now, of course, the answer would be no, negative. So let's see how Marx moves, okay? It's first of all, the apparent contradiction, according to Marx, is itself a form of appearance of the inner contradiction of commodity as a dual thing. It's a contradiction, like commodity is use value and exchange value at the same time. So in Marx's own terms, the simple value form of a commodity is therefore the simple phenomenal form of the inherent contrast within the commodity between use value and value or exchange value. So this first thing. Second is that quote here is that as a result, value was presented as an inner relation of a commodity to itself, outwardly revealed through the relation to another commodity. The other commodity played only the role of a mirror in which the inwardly contradictory nature of the commodity that expresses value was reflected. In philosophical terms, the external contradiction was presented only as a phenomenon and the relation to the other commodity as mediated through this relation as the relation of commodity to itself. So the inner relation, the relation to itself was also value as the absolute economic content of each of the mutually related commodities. Then comes, all in all, this is a contradiction that is rooted in the contradictory existence of value as self-valorizing value. How the exchange of equal values can yield a surplus. That's the question. There should be a commodity. Therefore, that's how Marx, I think, resolved it. There should be a commodity that is at the same time sold both at its value and not. But Marx notes, this is quote, turn and twist as we may, the sum total remains the same. If equivalents are exchanged, then no surplus value is created. And if non-equivalents are exchanged, still no surplus value is created. Circulation, the exchange of commodities, does not create value. So he concluded capital could not arise from circulation. That's just as it cannot arise outside of it. This is right before the fourth section of Capital, actually. It must simultaneously take place in the sphere of circulation and out of the sphere of circulation. And these are the conditions that we of the problem. Is the nut that is what we have to crack, as Marx says. So one problem that appears in two versions and which is again resolved by Marx is this. It's Marx's critic is this. First, I will come back to this again. Aristotle's inability to grasp the very law of simple exchange that he himself had conceived of, like Aristotle. Second, production of surplus value in the face of law of the exchange of equals, allegedly exchange of labor for its equal in form of wage. So how this was resolved? It was the very concept of value that is missing in the former, in Aristotle's, I would say, account, and that of special commodity, a particular commodity. This is another concept that is missing. That's labor power in the latter. So what I mean is this. There are two problems, as a matter of fact. One is, even when you look at the problem of simple circulation, simple circulation, it is not explainable. It is not very clear how two commodities can be, can be exchanged, given that they're qualitatively different. Well, this was later. In ancient time, it was not explained, but eventually, with the Ricardian labor theory of value, it was to some extent explained. But then there was another problem. Now, now we have the concept of, I would say, value, but not as a concept yet ripe. We had the concept of value in working this notion, but then now the problem was that, well, how out of the exchange of equals we can get a surplus? If you exchange labor, that's how jargon was at that time. When you exchange labor for money, let's say for capital, but at the end you receive something that is more. How is it possible? It seems as if it is value that is coming out of the belly of out of the belly of capital itself. And Marx resolved this, as I just mentioned, with this simple, very simple way, clear, simple way, philosophically simple way. And the question was that, could there be a commodity, so to say, in which its consumption and production of greater value is possible? And Marx says, yes, it is. And that's labor power, as a matter of fact. So what happens is this, the interesting thing is this resolution of this contradiction, or as a matter of fact, explication of this contradictory situation, is that what is being exchanged, as a matter of fact, on the side of labor with the capitalists, let's say, or with capital, is not labor itself, but it's the capacity to labor, as a matter of fact. So it is labor that is defined in terms of time, in terms of abstract time. So in a sense, like it is the laborer subsumed to time. And then, what is being paid for him, it's just, the amount that is necessary for its reproduction, for the reproduction of the laborer, so to say, and reproduction in the, the widest sense of the term, meaning that reproduction of herself and reproduction of her, family, household, and reproduction of, future generations of labor. So that's what is being paid, and it is being paid quite, and it's equal value. But what is being sold is this capacity to labor, as a matter of fact. So it means that it is the commodification of labor power. This capacity is labor power. It is the commodification of labor power, as a matter of fact, or the emergence of labor power as this particular commodity that can add value to the, the originally, I would say, invested value, so to say. So it is labor power, concept of labor power. That's very important, as a matter of fact, and of course, the consequent surplus value. Now, as to the conversion of dialectical methods, in the afterword to the second edition of Capital, Marx states that, and we had this as a quote in syllabus, that the ideal is nothing else than the material work reflected by human mind and translated into forms of thought. This statement, I believe, provides the core of the response to the question that Marx had earlier put forward in the thesis. And the question was, if you remember, the disworldliness of thinking that we have also touched upon in earlier lectures in the course. In a sense, this can be considered as a problem of aesthety, of whatness, so to say, of thinking and materialist dialectical method. Thinking, in this view, I believe, is a material force, material not in the sense of physical, of course, is a material force, and this can only be formulated, this materiality can only be formulated and resolved dialectically. So let's go a little bit back again to Kant. Kant's notion of thinking itself is a showcase of inability of non-dialectical thinking in explaining the transformation of thought into reality and that of reality into thought. So when I talk about materiality of thought, I'm talking about this reality of thought and reality that transfers into transformation of thought into reality and vice versa. Again, according to Kant, ideas can only be compared with ideas, since what we have in mind is not the real thing, but is its image. It can only compare to other images. Thus, the thing in itself, so to say, remains unknown. Why? Because, as a matter of fact, this phenomenal thing that we have, according to Kant, it's an image that is being projected onto reality through our, our innate transcendental categories. Okay, it is so what we are capable of comparing, according to Kant, is just this images that we have in our mind and the images that are being reflected outside. Okay, and that's why the thing in itself is something that is not knowable at all. This is the limit. Hegel's way out of dilemma is reducing reality to product of thought, if you remember from again last week, of abstract thinking activity, and thus identifying thinking and reality in an objective idealist form. The problem with Hegel's approach is that by identifying the two, I mean, by identifying thinking with reality, or by reducing, as a matter of fact, reality into this abstract product of abstract thought, any comparison or relation between the two is impossible. I mean, because you have to have two things, as a matter of fact, in order to be able to compare them, or in order to be able to relate them, okay? So rather than reducing one to another, as is the case with any of two exclusive objects, there should be found a third term that facilitates the comparison between these two objects possible. So that is supposedly the way out. The way out of such dead end is to formulate these different objects as modifications, or better to say, as forms of existence of one and the same essence. So this is, I think, the kernel of Marxian approach to the question. Marx's critic of Trinity formula, which considers wage, profit, and rent as three sources of revenue, is a clarifying example in this regard. Now, from the commonsensical point of view, as I just mentioned, it is true that capital produces profit, the land produces rent, and labor produces wage. As a matter of fact, this is, like you see it in common language, that money brings money. This is a daily thing, yes? But unless the one and the same thing of which these forms are modifications or forms of appearance is shown, this formula is just a theoretical absurdity as it compares, like it is like comparing a phone to a voltage, like something like that. We can think. With Marx's formulation of these three phenomena as forms of existence of surplus value or historically specific value producing labor, the differences as well as the unity of these contradictories become clear. So, like Marx's formula at the end of Capital, Volume 3, almost towards the end of Capital, Volume 3, is clear that what we know as rent and what we know as interest or profit and what we know as wage, as a matter of fact, these are just different portions of total produced surplus value. And they're distributed among, like these three classes, as a matter of fact, the rentiers, like the landowners, the capitalists, and the workers. But I mean, in a sense, they're all being paid by the worker whose labor power has been exploited, so to say. So I hope that we can open up these later a little bit. Now, thinking in essence is contradictory. That's what I think, like what comes with this. Just as any activity is so, like this contradictory nature of thinking is revealed in the fact that thinking and being form a dialectical unity, an identity of opposites mediated by historically specific human activity. At the logical level, one cannot speak of identity if there exists no differences. Identity without difference is just verbal. It's just, it's meaningless in a sense. Therefore, what's, I would say that how this identity of differences is possible is through practice. So practice appears as the act of identification of concept, thought, we say, with reality and vice versa. So it is in this sense that Marx speaks of Marx speaks of practice as the source of veracity, so to say, of thinking, or Engels talks about it as the criterion of reality of thought. From this dialectical point of view, the process of mastering knowledge, which is the process of learning how to think genuinely, or how to treat subject intelligently, is not different from the process of constituting the mind. This situation is rooted in the nature of knowledge, or the capability of thinking independently. Independent creative thinking is the capacity to handle a contradiction, meaning that it is the capacity to resolve a problem with proposing new tools, a problem that is irresolvable with the deployment of already existing tools, so to say. And then in this thinking, of course, the tool, be it a mental tool like a concept or being a material tool, is this very, like middle term, I would say, or the third element that will bring these opposites together. Now, the thing is this, thinking, where does it happen? Where does thinking happen? Or where does thinking emerge? Let me see. Thinking emerges in activity, of course, like within human activity, within practice. Although the thing we have to be careful about is that this activity is not, like something that is direct or immediate. It is not a one-to-one relationship between so-called man, like human being, and nature. I mean, this type of formulation, as if, like when we're talking about activity, or when we talk about the relation between human and nature, is something that Feuerbach, likes a lot. Feuerbach and the substance, like Feuerbach and substance materials work for. And that's, like it's being expressed in this demand for pure natural objects of contemplation. Okay. And if you remember, we talked about this as well. I think that according to Marx, and Marx and Engels, no such objects do exist. Even when natural sciences are at stake, that the objects of the study of natural sciences, even those objects, are being provided by industry, by trade, so on and so forth, and of course, by human productive activity, or by labor, but in its historically specific form. Hence, the immediate unity with nature, in immediate unity of nature, if there was such a thing, there wouldn't be anything like thinking, nor anything like action. Even with animals, it is not the case. Like the thing is that even our so-called immediate contact with anything, with nature, with surrounding, whatever, is mediated at least with our bodily organs or bodily tools, so to say. But more than that, in immediate unity with nature, we do not think. Human thinks only in unity with society and with the use of artifacts that populate society and constitute intellectual human culture. Why is it so? As I said, it's just, like even the simplest, confrontation with reality would be tool mediated, or whatever, if you want, you can say organ mediated, whatever you want to call it. The other thing is that when we talk about tools, and when we talk about, when we talk about tools, talk about immediate means that we're talking about human form of activity, productive activity, labor. And labor is something that, comes together with, constitutes, and just being realized in society. So it is the source of sociality of society, so to say, or sociality of human being, as well as it is only possible with that. So we can talk about maybe some sort of, logical precedence only. But the thing is that labor and society, they come together, so to say. And, meaning that such activity that requires tool, something like labor, including, like mental labor, including thinking activity, therefore is possible only in contact with society or within society. Meaning that taken out of the nexus of social relations, within and through which the human implements is human contact with nature, human is not capable of thinking, just like a brain that is removed out of the body. Therefore, the assimilation of human social intellectual culture comes to the fore as the necessary condition for emergence of consciousness, of a person that thinks independently, and therefore of thinking. And, with thinking, of course, of method, of dialectics, and so on and so forth. Now, the identity of thought and being, now in this sense, is a dialectical contradiction, a dialectical identity of contradictories. We should note that, first, for Marx, that Marx does not deal with ontology. He detests the skeptic arguments concerning the existence of external world reality. I talked about this before. And he concerned these as, these type of pseudo questions as some sort of, I would say, caprice of ideologists. Of course, the external world is there, first and foremost, is the condition, the source, the tool, the material of human activity, so on and so forth. And the very fact that human has to act is, the best, perhaps, evidence of the existence of reality, so to say. The second thing that we have to keep in mind is that, in this sense, the existence of subject, contradictorily, is the expression of the existence of object, or our subjective existence is the expression of objective existence. The third thing that, of course, follows right from here is that subject can only be the subject of object-oriented activity. The more objective becomes human activity, that is, the more it is actualized as objectified activity, the firmer the subject is constituted. Or to put it differently, the more naturalized become human through its humanizing action in nature, the more humanly and independent from nature as a subject it is constituted, and vice versa. The more independent human becomes, the more naturalized it becomes as well. So in this sense, genuine thinking would be, it would be, genuine thinking activity as objective thinking. It would be thinking in concordance, or thinking that matches, or thinking that corresponds, so to say, to the rules dictated by object, and vice versa. Now, there is another thing. For dialectics, for dialectical view, not only the laws of dialectics itself, but also laws of nature, so to say, these are formalized, these are laws that are formalized in form of, theories, conceptual systems, so on and so forth, in general appear and are meaningful only against and within the framework of social reality or social. That's one of the consequences. As I put it, laws of nature are laws of human activity in nature. They emerge only through mediation of human activity. Without human as the active nature, speaking of such laws is senseless. Actually, it is absurd that there is no such a thing as pure nature, as Marx succinctly explains in the German ideology. Therefore, naturalization of nature paradoxically coincides with its humanization, just as humanization of human coincides with human's naturalization. So, furthermore, to add something like human knowledge of reality, the object-oriented activity, the object-oriented activity-mediated material exchange with reality is itself historically bounded. So this brings us to a very interesting place. I think we can resolve the Kantian problem as well here with this approach. Human knowledge in this sense is universal to the extent that human activity is so. Marx draws attention to failure of substance materialism is grasping this point. For instance, he says that, if you remember again, Feuerbach demands for purely natural object of senses in one such fallacious conceptualization, for instance. There is no such a pure natural nature, even in the farthest corner of the universe, let alone, like any place on earth. So all laws of nature are the products of historically specific form of human social activity. This does not mean that these laws are real, mean that are sham, or does simple social constructs or anything like that. Not at all. Let's say their constitution requires this social activity or activity of social human being, or yeah, social activity, that would be better, because human is already a social animal. So in this sense, like even the most theoretical encounter with nature is activity mediated. It is mediated by a historically specific mode of activity of which it itself is an aspect. Think about it like this. I mean, the first human that looked upon the sky, perhaps did not conceive of it in terms of pure object of the senses, but as a calendar for following the seasonal changes, or a compass, or whatever you want to do. I don't know, even as gods, like. So the historically bounded nature of knowledge, on the other hand, makes knowledge limited and universal. So human knowledge and human thinking is always limited, always incomplete, but this incompleteness is not due to so-called, I would say, a limit that is put forward by so-called thinking itself, that Kant likes, but because it is bounded to historical transient form of human activity. Okay, and in this sense, it's very interesting. What comes to the fore is that all knowledge, therefore, is the knowledge of the thing in itself, contrary to what Kant thinks, okay? Because what is historical, as a matter of fact, it is this very thing in itself. And it is in this sense that, paradoxically, as may appear, the very limited and incomplete knowledge is universal and it's complete. And it is the rule of intelligent exchange with object, the historically emergent thing in itself. So like, if you, for instance, take a look later, I mean, at the dialectics of nature, or if you read certain passages from Ludwig Feuerbach, Engels' Ludwig Feuerbach, he touches upon these, problem of what I call relative absoluteness, so to say, or limited universality, so to say. Now, just to wrap it up, therefore, I mean, like, so what I say is that that the limited and incomplete knowledge is universal and is complete, as it is the rule of intelligent exchange with the object, the historical emergent thing in itself. And this brings us now to the source of the problem, the expression of the problem, the very contradiction itself, and its resolution, which is human being as the thinking, acting agent. Therefore, in this picture, dialectics emerges as the science of theoretical thinking, as the theory of identity of the opposites, and in particular, the identity of thinking and being through human activity or praxis, so to say. And I believe that this also explains, like this necessity for the convergence of method, as a matter of fact. I mean, not out of such, I would say, considerations, of course. Marx requires, I mean, like Marx goes for such conversion, to putting Hegel's on his head, on his feet, I'm sorry. But this conversion that he makes, which is also necessitated, as a matter of fact, by the very contradictory phenomenon that he was trying to analyze and try to understand, that is, in this particular, this capitalist mode of production, will bring about also this general outlook towards, towards reality. And I think this also will explain, for instance, in what sense dialectical laws are laws of dialectic in nature, or in what sense they are dialectical nature, or even if we can talk about anything like dialectics of nature, so on and so forth. So I have to stop at this point. Thank you for your patience. And I'm sorry if I was a little bit, going around, like at some point, like maybe, I don't know, I would try to condense things too much into each other. Thanks a lot.